Good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for being here. My name is Jack Newley. I'm the interim assistant to the director at the Boisi Center. I'm just going to give some kind of brief housekeeping remarks, and then we'll move on to our panel. So this is our last event of this semester. We're very excited. So thank you again for coming this evening. First, I'd like all of you to take a moment and please turn your cell phones to silent. Appreciate it. Second, following the event, there will be some time to purchase Mark's book. He will be available to sign copies. The signing table is in the back of the room there, my left. Really can't miss it, but just going to point for effect. And then again, just a reminder that during the Q&A portion of tonight's session, there's a lot of you here, so do try to keep your questions brief, just so we can try to get as many questions in as possible. And finally, I'm going to give some brief comments about some upcoming events, both for this semester and next semester. And I'll introduce our moderator, Rick Gaillardetz, who will then introduce our panelists and start our panel discussion off. So, just a reminder again. Our last event of this semester is actually, it's not a public event, it's for BC seniors only. It's a student town hall entitled Conversations That Matter, Who Belongs at BC? The class of 2019 discusses race, class, and community at Boston College. It will be hosted by Carrie Cronin and Barb Quinn, as well as a panel of senior students. So if you're a senior BC student in the audience tonight and you're interested, please go to our website to RSVP. Thanks. And then next semester, we have some events that are scheduled. There will be more scheduled, but this is our cadre right now. Our first is entitled Seeking Shelter. It's an exhibit that's happening at the Theology Ministry Library. Our own Mark Massa will be giving the keynote address, and it's an event that's focused on the social activism of Daniel Berrigan, William Stringfellow, and Anthony Town. That's on Monday, February 4th. Time for all of these will be, time and location will be updated in time. Next is an event, a documentary screening of a documentary called Backs Against the Wall, the Howard Thurman story, which is a documentary by Martin Doblmeier. That'll be on February 7th, 2019. It'll be a screening and panel discussion. Our 18th annual Prophetic Voices lecture will be given by Sister Beth Johnson. That'll be on Thursday, February 28th. Our second annual Wolf Lecture on Religion and Politics, named for our founding director, Alan Wolf, will be given by Kenneth Woodward, who is formerly the religion editor of Newsweek for over 40 years. He will speak on religion and its conflicts, relationship, and interactions with the American presidency. And then the final event we have planned right now is entitled Evangelicals in Politics. That'll be a co-sponsored event with the Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, and will be held on their campus. Randall Ballmer from Dartmouth and John Fay from Messiah College will discuss the evangelical reaction to Trump, among other topics. That'll be on Monday, April 8th. Great. Again, there will be more information about these and our yet to be scheduled events posted to our website in the coming months. Also, if you do not do so already, please do follow us on social media. All right. Our moderator, Professor Richard Gaillardetz, is the chair of the Boston College Theology Department, as well as the Joseph Professor of Catholic Systematic Theology at Boston College. A former president of the Catholic Theological Society of America, Professor Gaillardetz has published widely, especially around the areas of the Second Vatican Council and the Catholic papacy. Please join me in welcoming him.
Good afternoon. I want to welcome you as well to what I'm confident will be an engaging and informative conversation regarding the recent publication of one of our own, Professor Mark Massa. I will introduce Professor Massa more fully when we get to his contributions to our panel. Now, I'm not sure about the subtlety of the marketing for this event, but no one should question its effectiveness in communicating, at least in part, the subject matter before us. To be sure, Professor Massa's monograph, The Structure of Theological Revolutions, How the Fight Over Birth Control Transformed American Catholicism, sheds considerable light on the circumstances surrounding Pope Paul VI's controversial encyclical on birth regulation, Humanae Vitae. Yet our Jesuit colleague clearly has bigger fish to fry. That becomes evident with the epigraph he chose for his opening chapter, a famous quotation from Cardinal John Henry Newman. I quote, "In a higher world, it is otherwise, but here below, to live is to change, and to be perfect is to have changed often. It is indeed the question of change in doctrine, change in theology, change in tradition, that Massa is exploring." Although he acknowledges his debt to Newman's own groundbreaking contributions, Father Massa believes that the presuppositions that too often have accompanied theological explanations for change and development, including Newman's, have been too reliant on organic metaphors, too historically naive, and therefore are no longer tenable today. As an astute historian of religious ideas, Massa contends that strictly evolutionary or developmental narratives of theological/doctrinal change have taken too little account of the reality of rupture and discontinuity to remain helpful. Massa believes that an adequate account of theological or doctrinal change would benefit from the work of the philosopher and historian of science Thomas Kuhn, particularly his classic text, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. The title of Massa's own book is an obvious riff on Kuhn's title. It is Kuhn who forcefully challenged accounts of the history of science and suggested that science progressed not incrementally and in a rectilinear fashion. Rather, Kuhn insisted that science more often developed through dramatic revolutions that occurred when standard accounts, normal science, could no longer withstand the growing number of anomalies that were being encountered in research. Such a paradigm would eventually collapse, but only when a new paradigm had emerged, one which was better equipped to address the anomalous realities that had problematized the earlier paradigm. Massa proposes that this kind of dramatic paradigm shift applies as well to theological change. And it is this thesis that brings him to a study of the birth control controversy. A controversy which he contends represented precisely this kind of seismic revolution of paradigms. In this instance, the events of 1968 in the field of ethics marked the fall of a neo-scholastic paradigm for understanding natural law and gave rise to a succession of alternative natural law paradigms, represented in the work of figures like Charles Curran, Germaine Grisey, Jean Porter, and Lisa Sowle Cahil. If I understand his project then, Professor Massa is using the impact of the events of 1968 on contemporary natural law theory as a kind of case study to demonstrate the broader usefulness of Kuhnian paradigm theory for explaining other kinds of theological change in the Catholic tradition. Our panelists, I'm confident, will shed considerably more light on this project than I've been able to do in this briefest of summaries. So with that, let me turn now and introduce our four panelists. Professor Meghan Clark, immediately to my right, is a graduate of our own doctoral program here at Boston College and is now an associate professor of theology and religious studies at St. John's University in Queens. As a social ethicist, she focuses on questions of global health, economic development, participation, violence against women, and justice and theological ethics. She's conducted fieldwork on human rights and solidarity in Sudan, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Tanzania. She is the author of the monograph, The Vision of Catholic Social Thought, The Virtue of Solidarity and the Praxis of Human Rights. Next to her, our own Jesuit Professor James Keenan is the Canisius Professor and Director of the Jesuit Institute here at Boston College. He has graduate degrees from both Fordham and the Gregorian University. His work and research focus on theological ethics, including questions of embodiment, sexuality, Thomistic ethics, and 20th century Catholic moral theology. He has published numerous books and articles, including his much-discussed monograph titled University Ethics: How Colleges Can Build and Benefit from a Culture of Ethics. Our next panelist will be Professor Lisa Sowle Cahil, the J. Donald Monin Professor of Theology at Boston College. Professor Cahil completed her doctoral studies at the University of Chicago. Her research interests include the history of Christian ethics, New Testament ethics, Catholic social ethics, feminist theology, bioethics, and the ethics of war and peace. She too is the author of numerous books and articles, including her volume titled Global Justice, Christology, and Christian Ethics. And finally, let me introduce the central figure in today's event, Professor Mark Massa. Professor Massa completed his doctoral studies at Harvard and is now the director of the Boisi Center for Religion and Public Life. Several years ago, he completed his term as the dean for the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry and is now a valued member of our theology department. However, long before his arrival here at Boston College, he had established himself as an extraordinarily productive and widely regarded, highly regarded historian of religious ideas, with particular expertise in the study of the Catholic Church in America and the interplay of contemporary faith and culture. He is the author of 7 books, but it is his most recent contribution, The Structure of Theological Revolutions, which is the reason for our gathering today. He will at the end offer his response to the 3 panelists that will precede him. So with that, please join me in welcoming all of our panelists. And we'll begin with Professor Clark.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
I want to begin by thanking Mark not only for the book, but for the chance and excuse to come back and visit Boston College. Full disclosure, one of the things that Mark makes a big deal about in the book is that in order to understand a scholar's ideas, you have to understand who they studied with and their long intellectual history. As Rick noted that I did my doctorate here, so studying with Jim and Lisa, but what most people don't know is that Mark was my undergraduate major advisor at Fordham University. So if anyone objects to anything I have to say, you can blame the 3 people to my right. The debate about Humanae Vitae and the role of natural law is one of those areas that people often assume they know enough about without really investigating, almost relying on a gut reaction concerning birth control and not really pressing much further. This is particularly true for most of my generation. In a Commonweal essay noting the 50th anniversary, Ellen Koenig wrote that few people of my generation think much about this 50-year-old encyclical. There's a vague notion about it reinforcing Catholicism's injunction against artificial contraception, but it doesn't generate the guilt, turmoil, thoughtful argument, or impassioned debate it did for the generation that came of age during the Second Vatican Council. She goes on in her article to say that the millennial generation shouldn't be accused of apathy, that in reality what happened was that our parents made up their minds after grappling with Humanae Vitae and natural law and simply raised us accordingly. And in my opinion, there's a lot of truth to her observation. What very few of my non-theologian Catholic peers, including those who are convinced that Humanae Vitae is right and that the Church is right to prohibit artificial contraception, are interested in a serious discussion of Humanae Vitae or its understanding of natural law. Despite that fact, one of the important things that comes through in Mark's book is that it's a history that we need to know and that we neglect almost at our own peril. Natural law and Aquinas continues to loom large within Catholic moral theology, even when we don't acknowledge it, and even when it's not being invoked as the dominant source being used. It comes out sometimes on one side or another, almost as if it is kind of a weapon or a trump card in a debate, but for better or worse, natural law is still oftentimes operating around Catholic discussions of moral theology, and without sufficient attention to its history or the complexity within which various differences in different interpretations of natural law exist. Nowhere is this clearer, perhaps, than in the divergence, sometimes even seemingly complete break, that occurs between social ethics and sexual ethics in the way many people approach Catholic moral theology. A separation that does not make much sense when considering human flourishing in community, and yet tends to dominate both how we as theologians choose what it is we go into, or for those in the room who happen to know me, why it is amusing to anybody who was with me in graduate school that I'm sitting up here talking about Humanae Vitae and birth control. It just isn't the way in which it developed. You ended up with a very little conversation between Catholic social teaching in particular and Catholic sexual ethics, which did continue to grapple with Humanae Vitae. Some of the history for how, why, and even possibilities out of the current predicament are found particularly in the last 3 chapters of Mark's book, where he looks at Grisey, Jean Porter, and Lisa Cahil. In particular, Lisa's work detailed here is an attempt not only to engage pluralism and globalization, as he notes, but also an example of trying to have a more integrated Catholic moral theology where Catholic social teaching and sexual ethics come together in a conversation that is more integrated and not forced. Nowhere is that dichotomy perhaps more neuralgic and entrenched than in the United States of America. It is something that my friends in Europe don't understand, but is something that desperately the American church needs to grapple with, and I think that's a real possibility through engaging the history presented here. But here I come to my question for Mark and also perhaps for my other panelists. We tend to focus on Humanae Vitae and natural law as it is invoked in that encyclical for obvious reasons. Yet one thing I often find myself thinking about, and the rest of the field as we try and grapple with these separations, is where does it fit and what do we do with the rest of Paul VI? Why is it Humanae Vitae and not Popularum Progressio, Octogesimo Adviens, and then shortly thereafter with the Synod, Justice in the World? The question of natural law within the social magisterium of Paul VI, and in that dichotomy between Catholic social teaching and Catholic sexual ethics, is something that I think coalesces and comes out in the last couple of chapters, but in particular in the back and forth that Mark notes that Lisa had with Jean Porter about the possibility and the future of a global ethic. Is that something that is possible? And so one thing I would like to note is, in these paradigm shifts that happen, is there not more foundation or impotence laid by Paul VI in Octogesimo Adviens and Popularum Progressio that seems at odds with what we find in Humanae Vitae, and not just that these different strands come out of grappling with Humanae Vitae?
Great, thank you.
So I'm going to have 2 questions, just so you're forewarned. I see Ruby Yu here. Ruby is one of the 2 people to whom one of the 3 people to whom the book is dedicated. Ruby, this is what I received in my mailbox, this book, and then this note. It says, Jim, airplane reading, M. See footnote 3 in the intro, which is a nod to me. This is about charm. But I just think that many of your friends are here. And even though you put this in the program that you were responding to your critics, I don't see Archbishop Vigano. I don't see Grandula. I don't see people who would really go after you. You invited your friends, so let me talk as an aggressive one. I do think it's a really sensational book. It's really a very important contribution. And for somebody who's not in the field of moral theology, I have to say that it does us justice. I really think that to enter another discipline the way you did, and the amount of respect that you have for Curran and for Lisa and for Jean and for Jermaine is really wildly impressive, that one scholar could look at other scholars not in her or his discipline. And you do it with really humor, but most of all, truthfulness and honesty and a penetrating glimpse. So kudos. I think that this metaphor, or using the structures of scientific revolutions of Kuhn, to me made a big impact. When I was an undergraduate at Fordham, I had to take a geology course, so I decided to do a paper on Thomas Kuhn and continental drift theory. I wanted to see how the geologists eventually accept this thesis of continents drifting. And Kuhn has this argument that first, you need to say that the existing theory is no longer valid. Second, though, you have to have something that can replace it, that's autonomous in its replacing, so that it has its own machinery to explain all the different issues that have been broken down by the previous paradigm. And so this is really rather interesting to do this, because what you're doing is you're not raising the question about birth control, you're raising the question about moral judgment. And on what rests moral judgment. And that you do by looking at 4 different people, besides the neo-scholastic manualist logic that gave us Humani Vitae. On the other side, you have these 4 different authors who attempt different paradigms. But my question then comes to these 2 points. First, scientific discourse in the Catholic Church does not look like the scientific community, even on a bad day. Charles Curran lost his position at Catholic University. He was removed from a tenure-track job. No scientist ever lost his or her tenure-track position because of espousing a theory that I know of. So the scientific revolution that happens in the Catholic Church also is in the background of a highly authoritarian, centric structure that guaranteed that that paradigm stayed in place regardless of whatever reasonable arguments were given. Until finally, many in the church decided that they needed new models for how to arrive at moral judgment, whence your book, which is really very fine, trying to do that. How does that impact your argument here? It's not here at all. At no point, I think your most sensational chapter is the chapter on Curran. Curran is an enormous figure in moderating this debate in the United States. There's another person, Richard McCormick, who was not as inclined to objecting to Humani Vitae in the beginning the way Curran was. Something that Curran was prepared in a very different way. McCormick came to it in a slower, more gradual way. But both of them will take these positions. But now, this issue is not only about how it kept in place an old model, but what role will it have in the future? And that leads to my second question. What will be the future paradigm? Will it be Lisa's? Will it be Jean Porter's? Will it be Jermaine Griset, which 17 times you use the word brilliant to describe his position? What will be the paradigm that emerges, and to what extent will the authoritative structure of the Catholic Church play a role in guaranteeing that position?
Thank you, Jim. Please.
Yeah. So I brought 2 of Jean Porter's books as well as yours. I have all these notes. I've been trying to figure out, exactly how to focus. I'm not going to read all these notes to everybody. My final question is also, what's the new paradigm? But I have a slightly way to put it, than you did. But I want to start out by saying, this is a wonderful book. It's so clearly written. It's very witty. It's very concrete, And you did a wonderful job at taking all these authors and trying to show what are they trying to do that's really constructive. Like, we may disagree with each other, but you're not trying to attack it and use them as foils so much. You know, it's like, what is each voice contributing? So that was fantastic. And I also have to say, when you first told me that you were writing a chapter in this book on me, I was completely terrified. And I thought, I just have a bunch of scattered articles, and I'm not really worthy to be a chapter, and I'm going to be humiliated by having this put out there. And I have to say, I do think you did a really good job of interpreting what I was trying to do, but it was kind of amazing to me. Oh, look, Mark read this and that, and he says, I said such and such, you know. It was great, you know, I appreciated it. I also want to say that I'm very grateful, and I think Jean Porter would be too, that you tried to create a gender balance in this book that was not really present in the discourse of moral theology when all this was going on. Women authors were few and far between. Most of them were men, and for that matter, priests. And so you brought us up and you gave us a place, so thank you. I think that was a huge step in the right direction. I would like to make just one point about myself and Jean Porter. And what we were talking about and where we disagree and not. And I think I have a slightly different perspective than you took in this book, but I'm not saying that the perspective that you had was wrong. It's more of another dimension I want to bring out. So you titled your book on Jean Porter, Robust Realism. And I really thought your main point on her was great, and it applies to other literature that was going on at the same time, like Steve Pope wrote an article that did on homosexuality that does a lot of things that you saw her as doing. So she was writing about birth control, and you used her to show she has a realism about ethics, like there's real human values having to do with sexuality that we build our ethics on, but unlike Humane Vitae and even Germaine Grisey, she wasn't focusing on particular sexual acts, like what's the inherent nature of sexual intercourse and its procreative end, and how does that define birth control, etc. She was putting it in the context of the social context. What's the institution of the family? What relationships is sexuality about? How does it do with interpersonal love? What's the institution that it serves in society, or how does it serve as an institution in society? So I took your robust realism as pointing to the robust nature of the person in a marriage and sexuality, not just isolated sexual acts. And I think she was doing that, and it was really great, and it was a great chapter the way you showed everything. I think the real point of difference between her and me, and maybe this is a continuing issue, not so much between the two of us, but in general in theological ethics, and it has to do with how much universality and knowledge of what's universal is there really in different moral standpoints, especially if you look at them as coming from different cultures. And she wavers back and forth, I think, a little bit, or at least that's how I've always found her. And I just wanted to say, Jim and I were talking about this earlier, she went to Yale University, and I went to the University of Chicago, and the Yale School is sort of notoriously communitarian. This was all exacerbated when she went to Notre Dame and met up with Alistair McIntyre. So the good is only known by the community, and it defines its own good, and morality is defined within the community. So she has a tendency to interpret Aquinas as coming out of a particular theological context, and the natural law is a theological perspective. So in one of her books, Nature is Reason, she said something I would never say, which is the whole idea of human rights depends on a theological background, and you can't defend it philosophically. So I would disagree with that. That's not what Catholic social teaching says. In this book, though, and this is her most recent book, Justice as a Virtue, she says equality and human rights are in Aquinas, and they're also part of the natural law. That's her sort of going off in the other direction. And I agree with this book that she wrote, although I think she's stating too strongly that this is actually in Aquinas. But I think she's pointing to the emergence of universal values that we recognize differently now. Right. You know. So, yeah, so And then what you said really accurately that I'm very committed to is trying to show how even though in the abstract we can't define all these things about human nature and the common good, but we can certainly arrive at common human values across cultures that we need to have if we're going to talk about human rights. That's to use a more Western vocabulary. But the human dignity of women, as you pointed out. You know, why is rape being used as a weapon of war in Congo universally wrong? One of our doctoral students, Leo Kadi-Lushombo, has worked on that. Or other issues, you know, wealth inequality, global capitalism, market capitalism. So to even talk about those global moral and political and social issues, you have to assume that we'll be able to talk across cultures. It's not just our own cultural perspective, although that's also what's shaping our perspective on it, you know, is our own culture. So at the end of the day, so you traced that through your book. It was great. I thought you did a great job. I thought you wound up describing what I was trying to do correctly. But at the end, I had a similar question that I think both of you sort of brought up. And it's about what is the paradigm of the future. So invoking Kuhn was very provocative. You know, paradigms change. And do we, like even up through me in the last chapter, we're representing a paradigm from the 60s, 70s, 80s, maybe the 90s. Do we have something else emerging in the 21st century? I don't think they're going to go with either of these, or any of these. Like, what's the next step? In the context of like all the undergraduates or graduate students that are here today, even to just take sexuality, they're not interested in debating all the ins and outs of birth control and natural law. Is intimacy and permanency even a universal value of sex or not? Or are there other purposes of it? And furthermore, theology and even theological ethics aren't so much about discovering the analysis of particular actions, sexual or not, as about forming a community. You know, how do we discover and form community and create community? And I think a lot of younger people are really looking for that. That's what they're missing. How can religion, Catholicism, faith, prayer, you know, be about forming a community of identity that also has a way of life associated with it? So some even defend natural family planning as a way of life, not so much because the Pope says so and there's this international, natural law analysis, etc. So what's the next paradigm? And then, you know, with that, I'm also kind of looking globally. So I'm talking about this more in the U.S. context, which I know is your field, you know, U.S. religion and U.S. Catholicism. But now we're much more aware of global Christianity. And in global Christianity, especially the global South, the communal component of religion and ethics is not under question. So what is emerging there? And what sort of universality is that looking at within Catholicism or not? So I think there's just a lot to talk about in that area. And just one final little point. This is all your provocative stuff on paradigms and what are paradigms. But I started to look at what you were doing with Humanae Vitae, and you did a great job of showing how Lonergan brings out a historicist perspective. And I realized that I've often thought one big reason that Humanae Vitae didn't convince the majority of people is that it had already switched to the historicist paradigm of argumentation, looking at relationships, trying to make an inductive argument about the meaning of the relationship of married couples, but it was trying to use that new model to validate the same conclusion that had been arrived at on the classicist paradigm. And that was not convincing. If you really look at experience, you don't wind up with the same conclusion necessarily. So that's a little minor point about the paradigm. The real question is, where are we going?
I think I have to lay down now.
We all ask that. Yeah.
God has blessed me and my colleagues. Obviously, I have brilliant colleagues, so I'm grateful to be here at BC with such smart people asking these smart questions. I think that as people who've taken a course that I teach called Classic Texts in American Theology, David Tracy's analogical imagination has completely shaped me. So for David Tracy, where you start, your POV, your point of view shapes everything. So the screen, the preconceptual screen you have, shapes everything. And when I was at Fordham, the oldest joke in the Fordham Theology Department is, would you have a new cross
Tony Soprano and David Tracy, and the answer is someone who makes you an offer you can't understand. So I was trying to make an offer that you could understand. Let me just make a stab at answering these smart questions. Meghan, to me it's always been, I actually thought about writing in that chapter on Paul VI's reading both the minority and majority reports, rejecting both of them finally. Gregory Baum's incorrectly, the first year of the National Catholic Reporter, which is kind of the center-left organ, national organ. The first year of the NCR, Gregory Baum was writing on this, and he said that basically Paul VI rejected the majority report and accepted the minority report that had been largely written by a Jesuit, then teaching out at Weston here in Massachusetts, named John Ford. That's incorrect, I think. I think he did not accept that, because he recognized John Ford's model, what Jim Keenan calls the reliable manualist model, as really being separate, being a different kind of model than neo-scholasticism. I think it's one of the tragedies of Paul VI's reign that he, largely because of John Ford's argument about the Anglicans, what John Ford's letter to him said was, if the Pope changes, if you change your mind about this, the Anglicans in the 1930s said, under some circumstances, the couples taking birth control is morally justified and it can be part of a faith-filled life. And the church turned its back on that, Pius XII, and then Paul VI turned his back on that and said, no, any form of separation of unitive and procreative aspects of the act is profoundly disordered, is intrinsically disordered. Catholic moral theology doesn't get much worse than saying it's intrinsically disordered. That means it's really bad. If you die, you go to hell. So I think it's one of the tragedies of Paul VI's time that he accepted John Ford's argument about this for fear largely that it would look like the Holy Spirit was guiding the Anglican communion and not the Roman communion. I think that was a tragedy because, in fact, Paul VI's essays on his encyclicals, on social encyclicals and popular and progressive, things like that, were so incredibly forward-looking and prophetic. So I want to ask you that. I don't understand what would motivate a smart person like Paul VI to sort of like turn his back, and clearly neo-scholastic Thomism, as Lisa said, convinced no one. At least it convinced none of the moral theologians in the United States that read Humanae Vitae when it came out. And all of them were priests who were presumably not taking birth control. So presumably they did not have a dog in that particular race. So why would you turn your back on the realization that it was sort of prophetic and not convincing, and at the same time produce very progressive social encyclicals? I think that's one of the great tragedies, and I think that's another book. I thought about writing about that, but I'm not quite sure where I would begin about that, because I would have to know a lot more about who was actually advising Paul VI at the time. I think he was surprised. Paul VI believed that what he was doing is that he was actually sort of like lightening up the strictures against birth control. So Paul VI himself was astonished by the negative reaction, especially the negative reaction in the United States. He did not in any way expect that reaction. And as he himself said, this has been a consistent teaching, at least of the past century and a half of his predecessors of papal teaching. So why are people so strongly against it? Why am I being blamed, especially by Catholic moral theologians, the majority of whom are priests, who are priests in good standing with their bishops? I want to hear you talk. I want to hear you talk about that just a little bit. For Jim's questions about no scientist ever lost his job, well, except for Galileo, of course.
But by the church.
By the church, yes.
Not by another university.
Right. I think that what I discovered, that when I was writing this book, I asked and was accepted into the History of Science colloquium at Harvard, which is a group of philosophers and historians of science that get to talk about the history of science. And some of them buy Kuhn and some of them do not. I mean, Kuhn is one of these figures that has been much discussed and debated about. But most, I think, buy some form of the Kuhn argument. I think the reason why, and you implied this, and so I'll just put it out there, I think this is the point you were making. The reason why neo-scholastic Thomism lasted so long is you had a very authoritarian structure teaching it. And that's what you learned in Rome, that's what you learned in canonical faculties. That's what seminarians learned in manualism. And so what got lost there from the 19th century into the first half of the 20th, what got lost is the important role of university theologians. I think in the Middle Ages, in the 13th century and the 14th century, it was a common thing that the Pope would write to the University of Paris faculty or Oxford and say, I have this very difficult question, could you debate this and get back to me? So what the Pope himself would do was write to the theologians of these university faculties asking for sort of clarification on this. For all sorts of reasons, it's a very complicated story, but for all kinds of reasons, that appeal to academic theologians got lost. And indeed, in our own time, not so much currently, but say 20 years ago, academic theologians were viewed as the enemies of the magisterium. That not only were we not asked, we were positively distrusted as disloyal or an alternative church or a shadow church or whatever they're called. I think what happened with Humanity Day is it shifted the discussion back to a much older medieval discussion where university professors are part of the magisterium. I had a long conversation with A.V. Dulles when he was alive at Fordham, but he said that, you know, in the oldest tradition of Catholic theology, university professors were part of the magisterium. That we provided part of the insight. Not that we were in a position to teach magisterially, but we were in a position to give some sort of insight and broader perspective. What I would like to think is that we're back there again, and that university professors are actually part of the mix and can help the church think through these things in a clear way. We're not bishops. I don't want to be a bishop, you know, but I think we can help bishops understand more clearly what the issues are and what the alternatives, what the various alternatives might look like. For Lisa's question about, both Jim and Lisa talk about what the future paradigms would be. Historians make terrible prognosticators, so I don't want to predict what the future is. I would say 3 big areas are probably going to be future. One is the kinds of ethics that proceed out of liberation theology, starting with Metz and inclusive of South American and now North American feminist, gay, Latinx theologians. I think that's here to stay for a while. I think that's one of them. I think the virtue ethics discussion that Jim learned in Rome from Joe Fuchs and others, I think that's a really incredibly important retrieval of Thomas and a way of understanding Thomas that does justice to the complexity of Thomas's thought. I think that's here to stay, and I think that's obviously something that we're training our own students in. That's very important. I also think that the global South question is a big one. For me, one of the most interesting questions in the book, and Lisa obviously picked this up, is I'm a classmate of Jeannie Porter's. We went to Weston together. We were MDiv classmates together. Jeannie argues that one of the problems with neo-scholastic Thomism is that what was purportedly a universal form of human reason was actually decidedly North Atlantic male, Catholic, finally heteronormative. And therefore, she raises real, I think, perceptive and, for me, persuasive questions about how that discourse could be conceived of as a universal form of moral discourse, because there's so many presuppositions in it. My understanding of your debate with her was that she therefore said, we simply have to allow that Thomism, that Catholic natural law, the Catholic natural law tradition is a tribal language game. And it's better just to say that and say, well, it's a tribal language game, it works for us. We can't expect people from other cultures with other cultural presuppositions to get this. I think your pushback there, which I think was a smart pushback, was, but the realist part of natural law is a central one. In other words, we have to have, one of the strengths of adopting Aquinas, and as you know well, adopting Aquinas was not a foregone conclusion. He was condemned in 1277. But one of the final reasons why the church accepted Aquinas is because he seemed to provide a way of talking about moral activity that was reasonable, not rational, but reasonable in a way that people from various backgrounds who believed in God or who didn't believe in God could nonetheless accept that. And I like the pragmatic turn you make there, saying, let's not start at the top, let's start at the bottom. Rather than starting with global prescriptions, let's start at the bottom and talk about the ways in which accord has been reached on very specific things through the United Nations accords and things like that, which gives us something like a natural law. Is it realist? It's not realist in a 19th century scholastic sense, but it's realist enough for now that we can move on that. So I'm going to try and answer your. I'm going to start with Meghan. Do you want to venture what happened with Paul VI?
I don't know if I have an answer as to what happened with Paul VI, but I know it causes a rift that we're still in today. If you looked at sorry, can everybody hear me? If you look at the coverage of the canonization of Paul VI, depending on who was speaking, they were completely different people. I mean, it was amazing in terms of whether or not, Humanae Vitae was the thing that Paul VI did, and that's why he's being canonized, and this is why we're so excited. Oh, and by the way, there's also this Oscar Romero guy being canonized, but really it's all about Paul VI, and yet it's only this one element that they're talking about. And then on the other side, you have even subsequent popes who again have doubled down on this language of intrinsic evil, intrinsic disorder, doubled down on the argument that's made, who choose Popularum Progressio as the only encyclical other than Rerum Novarum to mark with anniversary documents. There's just a cognitive dissonance when you look at the teaching of Paul VI that Benedict XVI tries to come together in the way he frames Paul VI in Caritas in Veritate, but it doesn't come out making a whole lot of sense in that
I don't know if
sense.
it's still true, but the story I heard was that the two questions that people being considered for bishops were asked by the apostolic delegate is, do you support Humanae Vitae? The answer has to be yes. And do you oppose women's ordination? And the answer has to be yes. Those are the two litmus tests.
And in the US, that ended up meaning that you had a whole section of moral theology that largely was kind of ignored by the hierarchy that Jim's pointing to. That didn't want, right, that wasn't what was being talked about, that wasn't what's being preached about. Now that, to get to Lisa's point and your point about the global south, that gets very different when you leave the United States. The understanding of all of this in the global south is radically different because questions about development and global capitalism and the option for the poor are not fringe there, they're front and center. I'm not saying that the birth control question isn't too, but it is a distinctively American split that I think still plagues the way in which we're seeing the response to Pope Francis. I think goes back to the way people are interpreting.
I guess I have a question for Rick, since he's an ecclesiologist, the guy who studies church. Why are U.S. Catholics so obsessed with sex compared with other, with Catholics in Europe and Catholics in
I don't think that's an ecclesiological question, Mark.
But would you agree that it is?
Well, it is a particular preoccupation, yeah, but I'm not sure. I don't have any great insight on that. Mostly I want to step back into moderator rather than thank you for the invitation to that, but I want to make sure Jim and Lisa get a chance to offer a brief response to your reflections, and then I want to make sure we can open it up to the larger group.
I actually would like to comment on your reply to Meghan. At least my understanding of who wrote and how were people involved. I remember going to the Jesuit community in Paris, and Gustave Martelet, maybe some people recognize his name, but he would go around saying, I wrote Humanae Vitae. And he was the senior person on marriage in France at the time. So it was not an idle admission. By the same token, my own advisor, Joe Fuchs, said that all during the time of the writing of Humanae Vitae, Germaine Grisey, Ford's own student, but who thought very differently, who had a different model, perhaps, this new natural law model, that he was convinced that he had a hand in it. I do think that what Lisa conjectures, that it's an historicist document, it's like, you know, Godzilla meets Bambi. It's a historicist document, and then all of a sudden you get to paragraph 12, and you go, oh, no, it isn't. And in that moment, you see Ford and Germaine Grisey, and elsewhere you see Gustave Martelet. I think that another thing that we know is that John Ford wrote in his diary, and Eric Hanilo transcribes this into his book on John Ford. Ford writes about his visits to Pope Paul VI, saying you have no right to change church teaching. So I do think that those three factors, I think, are really rather relevant to consider. So just to throw that out. I think that the comments that you made about the way authority was left to the university is really an important model. I think that it's a much more collegial model, and I think it's one that we're seeing right now in the church emerging, and it's a welcome one. How long it works and it is something that we can leave to prayer.
Lisa?
I don't really have anything else to say. I'd love to hear from some of the other people. We'll never find out the new paradigm.
Just putting all the cards on the table. The reason why this book developed the way it did is that in previous books I came up to 1968, and I came to 1968 and then moved away, because 1968 is one of those like buzz years, and it was, you know, the summer of love, there's all kind of things happening in 1968, the Chicago Democratic Convention, but it's also the year in July when Humanae Vitae was published. And so I always pulled back, because it seems to me that's a book by itself. The question of the writing and reception of Humanae Vitae is its own book, and I didn't want to. What I started reading, and this is really the natural law part of the book, is even the people who supported Paul VI and supported the condemnation of Humanae Vitae, of birth control, people like Germaine Grisey and John Finnis, people of the New Natural Law, they argued in defense of it in a completely different way. And so I remember sitting in Lauren's house on College Road thinking, they're using the phrase natural law, but this is natural law of a completely different kind. And my suspicion was that natural law discourse is not this sort of seamless unilateral progress, a stream in which everybody builds, you know, X builds on, Y builds on X, but Z builds on Y. It doesn't go that way. It's much more disjunctive, it's very disruptive, and I think that's why I finally turned to Kuhn, because it seems to me Kuhn at least tries to make sense of the fact that this was also sort of influenced by my reading of Stephen Jay Gould and other people, contemporary evolutionary biologists, that when I was learning this about you know, when we were reading Newman's Development of Christian Doctrine, Darwinian science was in a completely different place. I mean, evolutionary science was in a different place. No evolutionary scientist would use that phrase to mean the things that Newman meant. And so my suspicion is that ease with which theologians in the past are, well, it's just the development of doctrine, it's just the development of theology. That ease that they presume that development in this sense simply means, oh, it was there in germ all the way along and it was simply a development. I can think of no physical scientist that would use development in that way. And indeed, I asked the physical scientists at the Harvard seminar, and they said, well, no, none of us talk about it that way. So that was my suspicion.
I want to open up, but maybe I would like to just offer a couple of things in response to what you were saying. The first thing is, I would maybe push back a little bit on the extent to which you think Paul VI ignored the Minority Report by Ford. Because an important element in that Minority Report was the argument from authority, was the question about the credibility of authority. And I do tend to believe that Paul VI was very much influenced by that part of Ford's argument. If we change on this, it will undermine the credibility of the church's teaching on authority. And I think that was a consistent concern of Paul VI during the council. It was a consistent concern of Paul VI in his entire pontificate. So just a small pushback there. I don't think he was sympathetic to Ford's neo-scholastic paradigm. He was influenced by Ford's argument from authority.
Right.
The second thing is, it's interesting to think about this in terms of the Second Vatican Council and the two events of 1968, and to ask kind of what if game. Because 1968 has two significant events in terms of the reception of the Second Vatican Council. One is around Humanae Vitae, which puts a huge brake on important contributions the council makes on consulting the faithful, on a positive relationship between magisterium and theologians, on the role of episcopal conferences and receiving church teaching and particularizing it. And many of them get stopped in their tracks because of 1968. But there's another event in 1968, and that's of course Medellin, which is all about receiving the Second Vatican Council in a very creative and innovative way. And for entirely different reasons, that line of reception of the council, which could have potentially been much more productive, gets stopped in its tracks for an entirely different set of reasons. So I just think it's kind of interesting to throw that.
Since you're doing this on history, just another reminder, and this is what McCormick brings to it that Curran didn't, and that is that 1967, late 1966, the majority and the minority reports are already being filed. Everyone in the Catholic Church knows that those papers are on the Pope's desk. They've been there, they will be there for almost like 14, 16 months.
And they're leaked.
And finally, McCormick writes, on the eve of this, there is practical doubt. Not by the church, but by the Pope. Why has the Pope not written on this? Why has he not invoked the argument for authority? So it's important to realize that for 16 months, there's this abeyance in which people are trying to figure out what will he do, and finally it comes out. So I think it's not simply 68, it's this 16-month period in which the church is waiting for a reply saying, I guess he's not going to use the argument for authority because he could have from the beginning.
And at least in Europe, both the majority and minority reports are leaked to the press, so actually a big chunk of them are actually published in the papers.
And there's practical doubt everywhere.
Well, we have another half hour to go, and it would be good to broaden the conversation. So if you could raise your hand, and I'll try and recognize you. And please, if you would, it would be good if you could address a particular member of our panel so we can kind of specify the kind of dialogue we want to have here.
Or how we reduce you to silence.
You want to ask a question, or else we'll keep talking.
Or make a comment.
Yes.
I have not read the book, but I look forward to purchasing it in the back right-hand corner. Thank you. I'm looking at the image behind you, and I'm wondering about this practical new technology that was available, and how did the availability of the pill cause a revolution of itself? If other forms of barrier method had been the only technology available, would the same questions have been asked, or was the church reacting?
Well, the story of the pill is a very interesting one, because of course, one of the major inventors of the pill was a Catholic doctor in Boston by the name of John Rock. And John Rock taught at Harvard Medical School, and he had a practice in Brookline, Massachusetts. He had a big crucifix on his wall, and he was the daily attendant of the 7 o'clock Mass at St. Mary's in Brookline. So he believed, as a Catholic, and sort of like coming up with the pill, that the church would welcome the pill, because unlike IUDs or all the other methods that had been condemned, it was simply using progesterone, which is produced by a woman's body, which keeps pregnancies from happening. And when a woman becomes pregnant, her body releases a lot of progesterone to keep her to keep a second implantation of a seed from happening. To his point, John Rock, as the Catholic doctor, said, this is great because the church is really going to welcome this. And he actually went around. There's all these stories about him. He's on the front page of Look, he's on the front page of Life, he was in Ladies' Home Journal, he was on all these things. He believed that finally, as a good Catholic, he came up with a way of providing an answer to this. So he was astonished by the response.
And he used the language natural.
Yeah.
This is using human nature to provide a way for responsible parenthood.
Right. So, I mean, so it's a strange thing that actually the Catholics played a major role on both sides of this debate, starting with the person who did more than any other person to invent the pill, what we call the pill. It was a Catholic doctor, you know.
In the back there.
Go ahead. She's bringing.
We're bringing you to the mic.
Like the other questioner, I haven't read your book, but I have looked at the index And I was struck by, at least what seemed to be the absence of two names. I only looked at it quickly. So, one was Harold Wojtyła, John Paul II, who wrote Love and Responsibility apparently during the Vatican Council, and who, my recollection is, Weigel at least thinks had an important impact on the thought of Paul VI leading up to Humanae Vitae, and then later gave his own pretty elaborate way of defending part of the teaching of it in the Theology of the Body, so providing a new context for it. So I wonder if you could talk some about that, whether you think that's true, that Wojtyła had an impact, and also what you think of his, whether or not you think that he in fact had a causal impact, what you think of his efforts to justify, in effect, Humanae Vitae in the context of the theology of the body, both in Love and Responsibility and then his later works. The other name that I noticed for its absence was Janet Smith, who has a number of books with, I think she edited 2 collections now, with the title Why Humanae Vitae Was Right, which gives away her view, and wrote I think those are edited collections. She has her own monograph, Humanae Vitae, generation later, and her effort to understand Humanae Vitae theologically in terms of the concept of munus and mission, and the mission of both the body, the mission of married couple, qua married couple. So.
Yeah, I say in the introduction that it's not a history of birth control per se. What it is, I'm a historian of American religious ideas, so my area is America. So I wanted to write a history of different models of natural law that gets started, different models that come out of this debate over Humanae Vitae and the birth control crisis, which he had clearly, as John Paul II produced 2 major encyclicals, Donum Vitae and Evangelium Vitae, to attempt to sort of ground Humanae Vitae in a more personalist sort of understanding of the human person. And he clearly did have a big effect on the discussion, but that was not exactly what I was looking at. And I decided not to look at Janet Smith. I decided I was going to do one, I basically was looking at 4 paradigms, and the one paradigm I decided to look at that was an attempt to shore up the debates in favor of Humanae Vitae was Germain Guizet's New Natural Law, which I think is a very smart sort of paradigm. But rather than, there's many people that I did not include. Like Richard McCormick is a major player. I don't talk about Richard McCormick either. So I was sort of quite consciously cherry-picking different models. And the purpose of that was not to say, by the end of the book, you're going to understand the complete and fulsome debate over birth control and natural law, but rather you understand how and why different models evolve, and how one model is attempting to shore up and answer the anomalies that emerged from an earlier one. So it is not, nor does it claim to be a fulsome discussion of natural law or birth control, the birth control debate. I actually think there are a number of really good histories of the natural law and birth control that have already been produced.
Down here, Mayor.
You asked or mentioned that the Vatican stopped consulting with universities on theological and philosophical issues. Would not the Reformation have been one of the main reasons for that?
Well, the Reformation certainly scared a lot of people, and it scared the Bishop of Rome a great deal, obviously. I also think what happens is the Vatican always utilized university professors, as was the case with Gregorian. I mean, they were always asking, especially Jesuits, to come in and secretly write these things. But they were invited. What they did not welcome was the collegial debate that Mark university faculty debates about theology. So rather the Pope or the head of the Holy Office would ask Father so-and-so or Bishop so-and-so to come in and write a draft of something, but that's different than having a fulsome debate. Now, somebody mentioned Vatican II. The thing that changes all of this for the church is that between 1963 and 1965, everybody, I mean, it was not on most American TV, but there were lots of reports about this. Bishops were actually debating theology, and they would disagree with each other on the floor of St. Peter's. That was something new, never seen before since the Reformation. That the bishops could genuinely disagree with each other and come to very different conclusions. That idea that the way that the church reaches its understanding of its teaching is not through some secret process in a back room, but rather in front of everybody on the floor of St. Peter's. That opens a door that I think surprised and for a lot of people was very welcome. And I think Catholic theologians like Curran and McCormick and others said, well, if Vatican II, if the bishops can do this about defining what the church is and what the church teaches, why can't we do this about this important sexual matters like this? Why was the model that produced all the famous documents of Vatican II, which was open debate, free debate, voting? I mean, we have the tallies. There were daily reports of how the vote went and who voted which way. Why can't we use that model to talk about this issue as well? So I think in a sense, the Vatican itself opened up this door by the way that the Second Vatican Council itself was organized and how decisions were made. And I think for a lot of people, like Curran and others, it's like, well, that's what we should be doing too. That's how we should be talking about this and debating this openly, not the famous line that Curran said that, that it seems astonishing that what was supposedly the ordered design of God could only be decided behind closed doors. Like Vatican II didn't decide it that way. So I think Vatican II, in a sense, delegitimized that more secretive. Undoubtedly, the Reformation played a role in making that and scaring people into doing it in a more secretive way. But I think Vatican II opened up that door.
Steve?
Well, thanks for the presentation. It's really interesting. I just have a quick question. It's quick to ask, maybe longer to answer. It seems to me that the paradigms of natural law would also include paradigms of how conscience works in the moral life. And that the clashing understandings of conscience that we see now is in part because there are these different paradigms still at play. Is that true, Mark? Could you explain that a little, or talk about that a little bit? Or maybe, I know Jim's done work, and Lisa and Meghan, everybody's done work on this.
That's a great question, and I haven't thought about it all, so I defer to.
Well, yeah, you go first.
This kind of intersects with another point that I was thinking about as we were just talking. And you were describing all the different natural law discussions over birth control. And I started to realize, especially if you take the example of the bishops from the Global South, especially Africa, at the recent synods on the family, and the way they were really trying to affirm their traditional culture and use traditional Catholic teaching as a way, as a sort of infrastructure for that, as against Western, North American and Western Europe cultural values, viewing women's sexuality, the family differently, much more open. So the role of conscience, I think the way that that was debated and whether the emphasis was put on individual conscience or the way conscience was more subordinated to what the teaching was and conscience should follow that, I think there was a lot going on about different visions of Catholic culture and lifestyle. And a lot of that was being threatened, or, both sides thought that their vision was threatened, I think. And so conscience, I think, was often positioned within these various views of what is Catholicism, what is our culture, how is it being threatened. And for the John Fords and the Minority Report, and eventually Paul VI, I think they saw this new Vatican II trajectory, and just around sex, it was really also about gender and about women and equality. And that's why, like, basing the encyclical on the equality and union of the spouses as the main basis for the argument, it didn't work all that successfully to shore up the culture from the past that, say, our parents grew up in as Catholics, or especially the Western nuclear family, the stay-at-home moms, the very traditional view of the family was something that they were trying to affirm. So conscience as freedom and individuals thinking more on their own and looking at their experience, which was a new experience of marriage, family, gender, that was very threatening to that lifestyle. And similarly, a lot of the Vatican II generation saw these protests as threatening to a new type of Catholicism, a new social experience, an openness to the modern world. And when we see this going into other cultures, there's a lot of the same dynamic. How much is this perceived partly as Western, coming as an imposition on these other cultures? Or to what degree is it perceived as, a strike in favor of women's equality or of the equality of families?
Can I add
So,
Yeah.
Moderator, can I add on to
Yeah.
what you just heard?
Yeah.
The thing that I talk about in my book is that when Pope John XXIII formed this committee that ballooned to 70-some people in 1963 and rendered its report in 1966. Two of the people who were important members of this committee were Pat and Patty Crowley, who are a married couple, very active in the Christian family movement. They're from Chicago. What they did is they polled married couples who were, the Christian family movement, of course, was made up of people, of couples who were trying to live a devoutly Catholic life in the world and so forth. And what they discovered about the bedroom issues of people who tried to use the rhythm method, natural family planning, and not use birth control, what they discovered is that almost to a single sample that they received, the response of the married couples was very negative. And Patty Crowley said, my conscience was persuaded by the data that we received, that if this was the will of God, that married couples should have to use this special kind of, the rhythm method, how could the will of God demand nothing but heroic charity on the part of these people? And almost all the couples said, our married relationship suffered because of this. And so that's one of those things where induction, starting at the bottom and asking people what worked and didn't work. She said, and Patty Crowley said, that changed my conscience.
Yeah.
But I couldn't, in good conscience, I couldn't argue this anymore.
But it's
Because-
also, but the inductive process is in a context and a
Right.
worldview that was shifting.
I'd like to add, though, that one thing that's going on here, presumption among Catholics in talking about conscience is moral objectivity. And that's what people were looking for. So the majority report was a way of taking a contrary position to Casti Connubii and offering a morally objective argument, saying that when you weigh all the different values here, you can come to a conclusion that it's time for change and to address responsible parenthood in a different way. That experience of coming to a morally objective opinion that's contrary to what the church was teaching is something that the church needed to learn. And one of the things that's fascinating after this is somebody like McCormick. When you read McCormick doing the moral notes all during this time, you see him arguing it with himself, presenting conscientiously how he's trying to proceed and how he's trying to do this. And you see all these people changing their points of view. My own advisor, Joe Fuchs, he was put on to the commission. He's put on to the Biblical Commission because he had written a book on natural law, and he was considered to be a sympathetic conservative, and that he would be a good contrary to Bernard Herring, who had an enormous amount of influence on the earlier commission. Fuchs is put on it, but he listens to Crowley. It's his experience of listening to a married person and the way she read things that he begins in conscience to realize that, as a matter of fact, she is more conscientiously getting to the truth of the matter than an aerial point of view, a more universal point of view. And he ends up becoming involved in the writing of the majority report. This to the consternation of John Ford, who had argued to Paul VI that you need to counterbalance Herring, put someone like Fuchs on, and Fuchs becomes the hero in the narrative of the one who writes the majority report. Conscience-seeking moral objectivity brings you to truth. And that's what I think part of this narrative is about.
Meghan?
I think it also gets into the question of authority that was raised before, right? Ultimately, the question of then arguing from authority, but Fuchs's position was ceding who had
Right.
the authority to
Exactly.
understand better and get to the truth and get to what was going on than he did. And I think part of what happens is, and it's tied up in conscience, but if you really take seriously the teaching on conscience, you have to cede some degree of authority and acknowledge that there is truth and authority that comes outside of this very hierarchical power model. And I think that that's what ultimately fell flat. But at a time when you have people developing more strongly conscience and making decisions in other areas of their life, and so it's just not found convincing.
I want to circle back to just a point I was trying to make earlier that this just reinforces, and that is the tragic irony that the Second Vatican Council articulates this important teaching about the value of the insights of the people of God and the need to consult the faithful. The Pontifical Commission represented the first formal reception of the Council's teaching. Here's a commission that's actually structured to consult the faithful, and it works. People like Fuchs and several of the bishops changed their views on the commission because of the Crowleys, and also there were 3 French couples who were
Right.
giving very moving testimony. They changed because they had the courage to listen to the faithful. Now, sadly, because of what happens with Humanae Vitae, it also becomes the last time that the magisterium will formally create a structure that solicits the input of the faithful, arguably up until Pope Francis.
And
and the
John
recent
the 23rd's letter forming the first committee says, Lumen Gentium talks about the famous phrase was responsible parenthood, but the document doesn't talk about what that meant. And so the whole thing was that this committee was going to explore what responsible parenthood would mean. So it was an attempt to take up something Vatican II had started in the first place.
Right.
While not actually changing it.
Yeah.
But that's what I think is brilliant about your book. I mean, it's really sensational. I mean, you put the pill all over the place. But it was that, as a result of this, people needed new methods of moral reasoning. And so you call them paradigms. But, feminism, the new natural law, Jean Porter going through natural law, there's situation ethics, there's proportionalism there's the ontology of others. There is a plethora for about 25 years of theologians trying to find a way to guide people as to what is an appropriate way of proceeding and making a moral judgment. And there's been a lot of books on on Humanae Vitae, but none doing what your book does. That's why you should all buy this book. But it does put out...
Or wait for the made-for-TV movie.
It does put out what it generated, what the debate generated. It generated a degree of creativity on an epistemological question of how do we ascertain what we should do. And that is an enormous achievement. Not sought, but it affected it.
Well, we have done what we academics do very well. We seized back control of the discussion here. But I want to again open it up and invite some comments or questions. Yes, over here.
Hearing the discussion of how the Crowleys affected Professor Fuchs, I found myself thinking about a quiet report, but I found it an astonishing report in the New York Times, that at the Vatican, the debate has been opened about a married priesthood. Should there be a married priesthood, that would also mean then possibly married bishops, would that be something that might mediate the new paradigm that Lisa was looking forward to beyond all competing versions of natural law and beyond.
When I was the dean of the School of Theology and Ministry, a reporter from the Boston Globe called me up and said that one of my faculty, he had just interviewed one of my faculty, and he was asking my faculty, a layman who was married, he was asking my lay faculty member what would be a sign of hope in the church. And after a pause, he said, a pregnant pope. I said, please don't publish that. But I said, I think, yes, I think obviously, I think a lot of, the astonishing thing, and I say this all the time at St. Ignatius where I help out, and somebody says, lay people have to take responsibility for some of this now. I think it's time that the laity are way ahead of the hierarchy in this, and I think it's time that things be done to make that happen, I think. I think it's way past time that be done, actually.
I think the example that you gave, a married priesthood, is an example of some of the problems that we're talking about in the development. I think that from my standpoint, or Jean Porter's standpoint, going to the book, I think both of us would say that a modern value that's actually a human value, it's just newly recognized, is the equality of women, and that the equality, dignity, and rights of women in the church would lead to access to various functions in ministry to which women don't have access now. I think the problem, though, is the same one that I was talking about before, the contextual nature and the inductive necessity of coming to these agreements. So someone told me, it might even have been you, but someone gave me the example of a Latin American country, this is what I don't remember which one it was, where there was a shortage of priests and some of the bishops were allowing laicized priests to function as priests even though they were married, because they still, technically, or I guess, essentially or ontologically, they're still ordained priests, so they allowed them to continue to function. So that would be a very bottom-up practice. It's not a universal argument about the church. It's necessity that leads to an insight. If you tried to take that to some other settings, it wouldn't sell as a universal proposition. You have to also, like I'm thinking especially of the African countries, some of the Asian countries, that would be a hard sell. And so it's got to come more out of those cultures integrally. And that's a problem that the Pope faced in the Synod on the Family, where there were all these different voices. He clearly was in favor of changes, but he realized if he just enacted these from the top, he would have another schism, just like Humanae Vitae, but it would be the more traditionalist people sort of pushing back and leaving and cutting off. So it's a huge challenge. What may seem obvious to me may not be universally defensible and not just in some natural law way. You've got to work much more out of cultures, worldviews, what's at stake.
So then we don't need one size fits all. Have a married priesthood in some countries and not in
Yeah.
Well, I think that's almost certainly the way it's going to happen. In fact,
Right.
My
Or
suspicion
it is.
is if we go forward, I would look for something to come out of the Amazon Synod, for example, in 2019, and far more likely would be requests from a local church to ask for this kind of development, which is actually much more
And
of
the
a
Pope has
bottom-up
asked for
approach.
that. The Pope has
Exactly,
asked
that's
for
my
it.
point. I think the Pope's made it
Yeah.
clear that's where the way he would see this going forward. We've had a student in the back, I think, with a hand up, and I want to make sure, yes, that we get a question to you, because we've only got about 5 minutes left.
Hi, I wanted to say thank you for holding this event. I come as an outsider. I'm not a theologian or a philosopher or anything. I'm just a social worker, so I don't know any of the people that you're talking about. But I came here because it's a deeply personal topic. I was homeschooled, and when I was a kid, when I was like 14, my state had a requirement that we had to take a semester of health education. So the way I fulfilled that was my mom handed me Humanae Vitae.
What did you say?
Just putting this in a historical context is like deeply radical for me, because that's not something that people from my neck of Catholicism were ever allowed to do. So my question is just factual. I was wondering when or who or how was the distinction ever made between artificial and natural contraception?
That's the big,
Do we have another hour and a half?
yeah. I mean, well, I'll speak to it briefly, but this is a huge, that is the debate about Humanae Vitae, or one of the debates. What So sort of originally, the Catholic Church and other Christian communions emphasized procreation as the purpose of sex. And then love started to arise as an equal purpose. But the Catholic Church was trying to argue that procreation still needs to be in the picture, while trying also to maintain that it's valid to have sex without intending procreation. So the argument that was given was that as long as you preserve the natural structure of the sexual act, then it's a moral, sexual act. However, to allow artificial birth control was already taking advantage of infertile cycles. That's what the Humanae Vitae is trying to do. And so basically it defined anything that interrupts that cycle as unnatural. And the question is always, why was that defined as more unnatural than a lot of other things that people do, not in the area of sex, or even intending to have sex without intending to procreate, infertile people, or taking advantage of the infertile period. Why were these things invested with so much weight that was the defining line between moral and immoral sex?
I think part of the strength of Catholic moral discourse is always, it has to be reasonable. It has to offer an argument that people can understand. It doesn't have to be rational, but it has to be reasonable. I think for a lot of people say,
That's not reasonable.
Charlie Curtin said, well, why is the use of a thermometer or a calendar, unnatural or natural, and the use of a pill is natural? Like, what?
Yeah.
How does that make sense?
Meghan.
Well, just very briefly, part of where it disconnects is because at the same time, modern medicine is developing in a way where this pill is supposed to be treated as somehow fundamentally different from all other medicine. And all other medicine wherein you have side effects, you have multiple things that it does in the body, and that's part of what didn't seem reasonable to a lot of people. And still, even people who say reject the pill today, if you look at movements going back to natural family planning, it's not often in the arguments that are made, it's not about artificial or natural, it's about a more holistic view, not just of procreation and sex, but of women's health and the body. So it also became a disconnect where, in terms of what is natural and artificial or unnatural medicine doesn't make sense with the rest of the tradition.
So our time's coming to a close. Since this discussion has been about Mark's book, I think it would be appropriate if I allowed Mark to have the final word. Or words.
I would say if you read it, let me know of any mistakes or questions. I know Oxford University Press is the publisher. They want to come out with a second edition pretty soon. If you find mistakes or questions, let me know, because I have a chance to correct them. It was fun to write. As Adam Krickeberg, who was across the hall from me when I was writing it, he'd come in and I'd be giggling at my computer. He said, I think you're having too good of a time writing this book. I learned a lot. My own experience is that I write books so that I get an opportunity to master something I didn't know much about. And I learned a lot. And the people here taught me a lot about this. So thank you for coming.